I have always believed that the world rewards clarity, clarity of purpose, clarity of ambition, clarity of self. My name is Daniel Grant, and before everything fell apart, people often described me as the kind of man who walked into a room already knowing exactly why he was there. Before we continue with the story, kindly support the channel by hitting the like button, sharing this video, subscribing, and commenting where you're watching from. I'm 38, tall enough to make people straighten when we shake hands, with a presence that usually made investors pay attention before I uttered a word. I wasn't born into power, I built it, brick by exhausted brick, starting from the tiny basement apartment where I coded the very first version of my tech company. Even now, lying in a hospital bed with machines breathing around me, I cling to that memory because it reminds me that I existed before this confusion, before the blank space in my mind where 3 months of my life should have been. It reminds me of the man I was before I opened my eyes and saw everything I had built slipping away. Waking felt like swimming up through warm tar, my mind dragging behind my body as if reluctant to rejoin it. My eyelids were too heavy, my throat too dry, my muscles stiff as wooden planks. The world came back to me in fractured flashes, the antiseptic sting of hospital air, the rhythmic beeping of machines, the faint hum of fluorescent lights waiting to be noticed. Before I could piece any of it together, a shadow bent over me, and the soft outline of a face sharpened into familiarity. Evelyn. My wife. Her dark hair was tied back in a tight knot, and her expression was an unsettling blend of relief and stillness. Her voice trembled when she whispered my name, but her eyes did not. Those eyes had always been beautiful, almond-shaped, warm brown, but in that moment, they held something unreadable, as though she had already rehearsed this moment and still wasn't sure if she got her lines right. When I tried to ask what happened, my body reminded me that I had been unconscious long enough to forget how to speak. The words came out hoarse, uneven, like a stranger was borrowing my voice. Evelyn leaned closer, her fingers curling around my hand with a grip stronger than comfort required, and she whispered that I had been in a coma for 3 months. 3 months. The number hit me with the weight of a hammer, sending a strange rush of panic through my half-awake brain. I felt the edges of my memories again, searching, clawing, but there were only pieces, the screech of metal, the flash of headlights, a sickening drop in my stomach. An accident. She said I had been in an accident. I wanted to ask more, needed to ask more, but the fog in my head was too thick to cut through, so I let her words settle like dust in a dim abandoned room. Evelyn stayed by my bedside for hours, stroking my hand, brushing my hair back, murmuring reassurances that felt almost scripted. She had always been caring, yes, but she had never hovered. She wasn't the hovering type. She wasn't the tremble in her voice type either. I registered all of this, even through the haze, and a small, quiet instinct at the back of my mind whispered that something was wrong. When she finally stepped out to make a few important calls, I watched the sway of her shoulders and the tension in her posture. She wasn't just tired. She wasn't just worried. She was bracing for something, something she hoped I wouldn't remember. I didn't have long to dwell on it before the door opened again, quietly this time, as though the person entering didn't want to attract attention. Marcus Hale, my attorney for the last 9 years and one of the few people I trusted without reservation, stepped inside. His expression wasn't the forced relief of a man visiting a recovering friend. It was something tighter, heavier, like he was carrying news that shouldn't be delivered to a man who'd just regained consciousness. Marcus had always been composed, 45 years old, sharp eyes behind silver-rimmed glasses, impeccably dressed even on his worst days, but right then, he looked unsettled. And Marcus never looked unsettled without a reason. He approached my bed cautiously, lowering his voice as though the walls themselves were listening, and asked how I felt. I told him the truth, I felt lost. Broken at the edges. Like I had woken up in someone else's life. He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening in that way it did when he was trying to prepare someone for bad news. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, and for the first time since opening my eyes, I felt a surge of alertness slice through the fog. Something was very wrong. Marcus waited another moment, glanced toward the door to ensure Evelyn wasn't returning, then leaned closer with the same seriousness he used when discussing mergers worth millions. Only this time, the topic wasn't a merger. It was my life. "Daniel," he said, almost whispering, "there's something you need to know. Something that happened while you were unconscious." My pulse quickened, and the beeping machine beside me betrayed it. I couldn't speak, but he didn't wait for permission. He swallowed hard, his throat tightening around the words he knew would break something inside me. "Your wife transferred ownership of the company. She owns it now. All of it." For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. The fog in my brain felt like it expanded, swallowing logic, swallowing reality, leaving me suspended in disbelief. But Marcus held my gaze with the steady certainty of a man who dealt in facts, not speculation. And in that look, I knew he wasn't mistaken. The world around me seemed to tilt, and I felt the slow, rising heat of betrayal, cold at its core but burning at the edges. Evelyn, my wife, the woman whose hand had just been squeezing mine with trembling devotion, had taken everything while I lay unconscious. I tried to form words, but my voice cracked under the weight of shock. Marcus reached for the file tucked under his arm, his hand slightly shaking, and when he opened it, the neatly arranged papers felt like a funeral shroud laid over the remnants of my former life. I scanned the blurred lines and signatures that supposedly belonged to me, dated during the months I had been comatose. Forged. They had to be forged. And the moment that truth settled into my bones, something inside me awakened, something sharper and more focused than fear. Because if Evelyn had stolen my company while I was defenseless, then whatever story she planned to tell me next would come wrapped in lies. And I needed to be ready for all of them. The silence after Marcus revealed the truth felt thick enough to choke on, as if the hospital room itself had sealed shut to trap me with the weight of his words. I stared at the papers he placed on the rolling tray beside my bed, my own forged signature staring back with cold confidence, mocking my frailty. A part of me wanted to deny the possibility that Evelyn, the woman I had held through triumphs and failures, could have orchestrated something so calculated. But another part of me, the part shaped by years of negotiations, betrayals, and harsh realities, recognized the precision of what she had done. This wasn't impulsive or emotional. This was structured, prepared, meticulously timed to take advantage of my paralysis. And even though my body was weak, my mind began piecing together the puzzle with a clarity that terrified me, because if she could do this while I lay helpless, then I had no idea what other truths were waiting beneath the surface. Marcus pulled a chair closer to my bed, lowering himself with the careful posture of a man who didn't want to spook a wounded animal. I saw the concern in his eyes, genuine and unmasked, but it only highlighted the contrast between the loyalty he offered and the betrayal Evelyn had managed so flawlessly. My throat tightened as I tried to swallow the reality forming around me, each breath feeling heavier than the last. Marcus began explaining the sequence of events, how Evelyn had claimed emergency authority, pressured the board, and filed transfer documents through channels that raised subtle red flags he couldn't ignore. He told me about the rushed signatures, the late-night filings, the quiet phone calls made from hospital hallways. Listening to him felt like watching a slow-motion replay of a disaster I didn't know I had been living through, a catastrophe unfolding inch by inch while I slept in darkness. And as Marcus spoke, the truth crystallized: this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an intentional takeover executed with cold precision. The door clicked faintly in the distance, a small sound that jolted both of us into instant alertness. Marcus straightened, slipping the documents back into the folder with a speed that betrayed his calm expression. I felt my pulse spike as his gaze flicked toward the door. Moments later, Evelyn walked in, her features rearranged into the same gentle concern she had worn earlier, like a mask she had carefully fastened before stepping inside. She carried a small cup of iced chips and a smile that now felt like a blade pressed against my throat. Marcus stood up with a practiced politeness, offering her the kind of greeting people use when they're hiding something behind their teeth. She glanced between us, her eyes narrowing just slightly, almost imperceptibly, but I saw it. For the first time since waking up, I saw the calculation beneath her softness, the quiet measuring of risk and exposure. She asked what we had been discussing, and before I could force a word out of my dry throat, Marcus smoothly replied that he was checking on legal matters related to my accident. Evelyn nodded, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. When Marcus excused himself, promising to return the next day, I watched him leave like a lifeline slipping through my fingers. The room felt colder the moment the door shut behind him. Evelyn set the cup of ice chips on the tray, adjusting my blanket with tenderness that now felt like performance. She asked if Marcus had upset me, her voice a quiet mixture of concern and suspicion, but I couldn't answer without giving myself away. Instead, I forced a weak nod, pretending fatigue was overpowering me. She leaned down and kissed my forehead, lingering a moment too long, as though trying to search my half-open eyes for any sign of awareness she didn't intend for me to have. I kept my expression flat, my breaths deliberately shallow, and after a long pause, she finally stepped back. My wife, the woman I had trusted with my life, studied me like a guard assessing a prisoner's hiding place. And when she finally turned away to check the machine settings, I allowed my eyes to close, not from exhaustion but from strategy. As soon as she believed I had drifted to sleep, her posture shifted subtly, giving me my first true glimpse of the real Evelyn beneath the layers of practiced worry. Her shoulders straightened, her face tightened, and her movements became sharper, more purposeful. She pulled out her phone, lowering her voice as she stepped toward the corner of the room. Even though her words were hushed, fragments drifted through the air, references to timelines, signatures, and Marcus interfering. Every syllable felt like a needle threading itself into the fragile fabric of what I thought my marriage was. I kept my breathing steady, pretending oblivion, even as her whispered frustration cut through me. She ended the call with a terse sigh, muttering something under her breath about needing to act fast. The phrase sent a cold tremor through me. Whatever she had done wasn't finished. And whatever she feared Marcus would uncover was likely far worse than the theft of the company alone. When she finally left the room to meet with a doctor, I opened my eyes, feeling the weight of my situation settle onto me with unmistakable clarity. I was weak, vulnerable, dependent on machines and medication, but my mind was no longer clouded. The betrayal wasn't just a legal maneuver or a desperate act. It was a revelation of who Evelyn truly was when she believed I could never wake up to see it. And now that I had seen it, now that the truth was pulsing through me like electricity, I understood something she didn't know yet. I might have been unconscious for months, but I was awake now. Fully awake. And whoever Evelyn had become in the silence of my coma, she was about to learn that I was no longer the man who trusted blindly. I was the man she had underestimated. And soon, very soon, I would make her understand exactly what that mistake would cost her. The hours that followed felt like drifting through a maze where every shadow carried the outline of a trap, and every breath reminded me of how fragile my position was. Evelyn stayed with me longer than she had earlier, sitting in a chair pulled so close to the bed that her knee brushed the mattress each time she shifted. She talked softly, filling the quiet with reassurances about my recovery and whispered updates about the company as if she had any right to speak about it with such calm authority. I nodded where appropriate, allowed my gaze to unfocus as though the medication made it difficult to concentrate, and forced my breathing to remain slow and steady even when her fingers brushed my wrist and sent a trail of discomfort crawling up my arm. I listened to her carefully crafted monologue about how she had stepped up when everything seemed to be falling apart, how the board needed someone decisive, and how she had protected my legacy the best she could. Her voice carried the measured cadence of someone rehearsing a story, one she had likely repeated to herself until she believed her own lies. But beneath the soothing tone, I caught brief fractures, tightening of her jaw, a clipped syllable, a momentary flicker of irritation, as though she feared I might question her narrative before I was supposed to. And while I let her continue weaving her illusion, I felt a quiet rage settle deeper into my bones, firm and unmoving, a promise to myself that I would not let my life be rewritten by someone who had taken advantage of my unconscious body. When Evelyn finally excused herself to take a phone call in the hallway, the moment the door clicked shut behind her felt like the room had exhaled. I used the brief solitude to reach for my phone again, my hands trembling slightly not from fear but from the sheer weakness that made even small movements exhausting. Unlocking it revealed another flood of notifications, most irrelevant, but a handful caught my attention. Emails from my CFO asking for clarification on directives he believed I had given during my hospital recovery, messages from board members expressing concern about sudden changes in leadership structure, and one cryptic text from my head of security that simply asked, "Is this really what you want?" It all painted a picture of chaos wrapped in controlled messaging, a restructuring done in haste behind the thin veil of me supposedly approving decisions I hadn't even been awake to witness. Each message reinforced the truth Marcus had already forced me to confront. Evelyn had used my absence not as a temporary stewardship but as an opportunity to seize power with startling efficiency. My phone's battery was low, and I knew I couldn't risk her discovering I was reading messages she likely hoped were buried beneath the noise of the previous months, so I locked it and tucked it under the mattress with a subtle shift of my hand. The effort left me drained, and I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the exhaustion wash over me in slow, heavy waves until my breathing steadied again. But even through my fatigue, one thought remained sharp: if Evelyn had been so thorough in stripping me of control, then she would not hesitate to eliminate any threat that stood in her way, including Marcus. The door opened again, and Evelyn slipped back inside, her expression calm but her hair slightly out of place in a way that told me the phone call had not gone as she hoped. She moved toward the bed with the same deliberate softness she used before, but now that I knew what lived behind her eyes, I recognized the calculation threaded through every step. She asked if I was comfortable, if the medication was manageable, if I needed anything, and I answered with minimal effort, allowing my voice to remain weak and unsteady. She examined my face for a moment, searching for any indication that I was hiding more awareness than I let on, and the intensity of her stare made my skin prickle. When she finally spoke again, her tone was lined with carefully placed concern as she told me certain decisions regarding the company may need my signature soon, once I regained more strength. Every instinct in me tightened at the idea of giving her access to my identity, my legal authority, my autonomy, everything she had already proven she was willing to exploit. I murmured something about needing rest before discussing anything complicated, and she accepted it with a small nod, though the faint clench of her jaw told me she wasn't pleased by the delay. She smoothed the blanket around my legs, touched my arm, and flashed a smile that would have once brought me comfort but now felt like a polished blade disguised as kindness. And in that moment, as she lingered by my bedside with a look of subtle impatience disguised beneath tenderness, I understood the most important truth of all: Evelyn believed she was still ahead of me. She believed the coma had left me too weak, too fogged, too dependent to fight back. What she didn't realize yet was that every breath I took, every second I stayed quiet, every nod of compliance she interpreted as trust, was the foundation of the trap I was slowly, carefully beginning to lay. The hours that followed felt like drifting through a maze where every shadow carried the outline of a trap, and every breath reminded me of how fragile my position was. Evelyn stayed with me longer than she had earlier, sitting in a chair pulled so close to the bed that her knee brushed the mattress each time she shifted. She talked softly, filling the quiet with reassurances about my recovery and whispered updates about the company as if she had any right to speak about it with such calm authority. I nodded where appropriate, allowed my gaze to unfocus as though the medication made it difficult to concentrate, and forced my breathing to remain slow and steady even when her fingers brushed my wrist and sent a trail of discomfort crawling up my arm. I listened to her carefully crafted monologue about how she had stepped up when everything seemed to be falling apart, how the board needed someone decisive, and how she had protected my legacy the best she could. Her voice carried the measured cadence of someone rehearsing a story, one she had likely repeated to herself until she believed her own lies. But beneath the soothing tone, I caught brief fractures, tightening of her jaw, a clipped syllable, a momentary flicker of irritation, as though she feared I might question her narrative before I was supposed to. And while I let her continue weaving her illusion, I felt a quiet rage settle deeper into my bones, firm and unmoving, a promise to myself that I would not let my life be rewritten by someone who had taken advantage of my unconscious body. When Evelyn finally excused herself to take a phone call in the hallway, the moment the door clicked shut behind her felt like the room had exhaled. I used the brief solitude to reach for my phone again, my hands trembling slightly not from fear but from the sheer weakness that made even small movements exhausting. Unlocking it revealed another flood of notifications, most irrelevant, but a handful caught my attention. Emails from my CFO asking for clarification on directives he believed I had given during my hospital recovery, messages from board members expressing concern about sudden changes in leadership structure, and one cryptic text from my head of security that simply asked, "Is this really what you want?" It all painted a picture of chaos wrapped in controlled messaging, a restructuring done in haste behind the thin veil of me supposedly approving decisions I hadn't even been awake to witness. Each message reinforced the truth Marcus had already forced me to confront. Evelyn had used my absence not as a temporary stewardship but as an opportunity to seize power with startling efficiency. My phone's battery was low, and I knew I couldn't risk her discovering I was reading messages she likely hoped were buried beneath the noise of the previous months, so I locked it and tucked it under the mattress with a subtle shift of my hand. The effort left me drained, and I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the exhaustion wash over me in slow, heavy waves until my breathing steadied again. But even through my fatigue, one thought remained sharp: if Evelyn had been so thorough in stripping me of control, then she would not hesitate to eliminate any threat that stood in her way, including Marcus. The door opened again, and Evelyn slipped back inside, her expression calm but her hair slightly out of place in a way that told me the phone call had not gone as she hoped. She moved toward the bed with the same deliberate softness she used before, but now that I knew what lived behind her eyes, I recognized the calculation threaded through every step. She asked if I was comfortable, if the medication was manageable, if I needed anything, and I answered with minimal effort, allowing my voice to remain weak and unsteady. She examined my face for a moment, searching for any indication that I was hiding more awareness than I let on, and the intensity of her stare made my skin prickle. When she finally spoke again, her tone was lined with carefully placed concern as she told me certain decisions regarding the company may need my signature soon, once I regained more strength. Every instinct in me tightened at the idea of giving her access to my identity, my legal authority, my autonomy, everything she had already proven she was willing to exploit. I murmured something about needing rest before discussing anything complicated, and she accepted it with a small nod, though the faint clench of her jaw told me she wasn't pleased by the delay. She smoothed the blanket around my legs, touched my arm, and flashed a smile that would have once brought me comfort but now felt like a polished blade disguised as kindness. And in that moment, as she lingered by my bedside with a look of subtle impatience disguised beneath tenderness, I understood the most important truth of all: Evelyn believed she was still ahead of me. She believed the coma had left me too weak, too fogged, too dependent to fight back. What she didn't realize yet was that every breath I took, every second I stayed quiet, every nod of compliance she interpreted as trust, was the foundation of the trap I was slowly, carefully beginning to lay. The night settled over the hospital in a way that made the world outside feel impossibly distant, like a life I had once lived and could no longer reach, and as the hallway lights dimmed and the steady hum of the ventilation system became the loudest sound in the room, I realized that this darkness offered something I desperately needed: time to think without Evelyn hovering beside me like a shadow with too much interest in my silence. My body still felt like a prison made of aching bones and unresponsive muscles, but my mind had sharpened with every passing hour, fueled by the betrayal I could no longer deny. I lay there staring at the faint reflection of myself in the black window, pale skin, hollow cheeks, eyes that carried the weight of months stolen from me, and the burden of truth returned too abruptly. I barely recognized the man looking back, but beneath the frailty I saw something familiar, a glint of determination, the kind that had carried me through sleepless nights and uncertain years when I built my company from nothing. That part of me wasn't gone, it had just been buried under weakness. And now that the truth had clawed its way back into my awareness, that part of me refused to remain dormant. Evelyn had shifted from the woman I once loved to the threat I now had to outthink, and in this fragile quiet, the strategies began forming in the corners of my mind like flickers of light in a long, dark tunnel. A nurse came in briefly to check my vitals, her presence soft and tentative, the way people behave around those who have brushed too close to death. She adjusted my fore and asked if I needed something to help me sleep, and for a moment I considered pretending I was resting easily, but then another thought sparked. If Evelyn believed I was medicated and unconscious, she might let down her guard or make a mistake within earshot. So I shook my head gently, telling the nurse I preferred not to take anything that would cloud my thoughts. She studied me with a faint mixture of concern and recognition, as though she sensed more going on than I was willing to say aloud, but she didn't push the issue. She simply dimmed the lights and slipped out, leaving the soft glow of the monitor screens illuminating the room in shades of artificial blue. When the door closed, I turned my head slightly and stared at the hallway through the narrow crack beneath the frame, listening for footsteps and watching for shadows. Every ounce of awareness felt vital now, as though danger lingered just beyond the boundary of the sliding wooden door. And in the rising pulse of tension, one truth became clearer than ever: if I wanted any chance of taking back my life, I would need to gather information from the inside, not just rely on Marcus's warnings. I would need someone here who could watch Evelyn when I couldn't, someone whose loyalty wasn't for sale, someone who understood that what lingered beneath Evelyn's smile wasn't devotion but a carefully concealed threat. A few minutes later, faint footsteps echoed outside, too light to be a doctor, too deliberate to belong to a wandering patient, and I held my breath as the door handle clicked softly. Evelyn stepped inside, carrying the faint scent of expensive perfume that once felt comforting but now triggered an instinctive tightening in my chest. She moved quietly, believing I was half asleep, and pulled the chair closer to the bed, lowering herself with slow, controlled movements. I kept my eyes mostly closed, leaving only a small slit to observe her without giving myself away. She studied my face for a long moment, her fingers interlaced on her lap, her posture perfectly still except for the faint tap of her thumb against her knuckle. That tap revealed more than she intended. She was anxious, restless, unsure whether her plans were unraveling faster than she expected. Then she leaned forward, lowering her voice to a whisper so soft I had to strain to catch it. She spoke to me as though I couldn't hear, almost confessing to the air instead of to a conscious man. She said things about timelines, and securing the final signatures, and needing to move before Marcus interferes further, each phrase confirming exactly what I feared. Her takeover was not complete, and my revival had placed her in a race against exposure. I felt the slow, simmering heat of anger spread through me, a deep pulse of resentment that strengthened my resolve rather than clouding it. She kept whispering to herself, pacing slightly now, rubbing her arms as though the chill of uncertainty had seeped into her bones. Her vulnerability in that moment wasn't a weakness to pity, it was proof that she knew she had crossed a line she could never uncross. And the more she paced, the more her mask cracked at the edges, revealing the frantic calculation beneath her surface. I kept my breathing slow and shallow, refusing to betray that I was tracking every word with razor focus, and eventually she settled back into the chair, exhaling through her nose before resting her hand lightly against mine, a gesture that made my skin crawl. She whispered, "You're safe with me, Daniel," and the words landed with a hollow weight that tasted like poison on the tongue. When she finally left the room long after midnight, her heels clicking softly down the hallway until the sound faded completely, I opened my eyes fully and let out a slow, deliberate breath. My body trembled from exhaustion, but my mind felt electrified, brimming with clarity and purpose. Evelyn believed I was still trapped in weakness, trapped in confusion, trapped in the fog of recovery, but she was wrong. I had spent most of my adult life solving problems no one else could, cutting through deception, anticipating threats before they formed. And now the greatest threat to my life wasn't the accident that put me in this bed, it was the woman who had stolen everything while smiling at my bedside. As the quiet of the night enveloped me again, I made a silent vow to myself, would not let her finish what she started. I would gather strength quietly, observe carefully, and strike precisely when the moment came. Because if Evelyn thought I was too broken to fight back, she was about to learn just how dangerous a man can be when he wakes up in the ruins of his own life. I didn't sleep at all after Evelyn left the room, even though my body begged for rest and my eyelids felt weighted like sandbags. The silence of the hospital pressed in around me, thick and almost suffocating, but instead of drifting into unconsciousness, I let my thoughts churn through everything I had overheard. Each whispered sentence replayed like a grainy recording looping inside my skull, sharpening into something undeniable. She had a timeline. She needed signatures. She feared Marcus interfering. None of that belonged to a loyal wife scared of her husband's fragile recovery. It belonged to someone orchestrating a finish to a betrayal that had begun long before I awoke. The more I thought about it, the more memories began stitching themselves together, small, seemingly insignificant moments from before the accident. A phone call she abruptly ended when I walked into the room. The sudden interest she took in meeting with investors without telling me who they were. The way she insisted I increase her access to operational accounts for convenience. At the time, I thought I was being cynical or paranoid, and she had brushed off my questions with laughter that now felt rehearsed. But here in the dim glow of machines and shadows, those moments no longer felt random. They were threads of a tapestry I had been too trusting to unravel. By the time the first gray hints of dawn seeped through the blinds, I had made a decision that steadied my pulse and quieted the chaotic storm inside me. I needed an ally inside the hospital, someone who wasn't connected to Evelyn, someone who could observe what I couldn't. I couldn't rely solely on Marcus, because he wasn't here. He was in the outside world where Evelyn still wielded stolen power. Inside these walls, she believed she controlled the narrative, and I needed that illusion to continue long enough for me to slip information through the cracks. When the morning nurse entered, a different woman from the night before, I watched her closely as she checked my blood pressure and asked a few routine questions. Something about her energy was different, alert, straightforward, not overly sweet in the way Evelyn preferred people to be around her. Her badge read A. Torres, and she moved with an efficiency that told me she didn't waste time on niceties or false pleasantries. So I whispered to her, very quietly, asking if she could shut the door for a moment. She hesitated, studying my face with a subtle frown, but she obliged, closing it softly until the hallway noise was muted. I told her that I believed something was wrong, that certain documents concerning my company had been signed while I was unconscious, and that I feared my wife was manipulating my medical condition for her own gain. I expected skepticism, maybe pity, but instead she listened intently, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in disbelief but in contemplation. She said she couldn't intervene legally, but she could observe unusual behavior, note who came and went, and inform me quietly of anything that deviated from normal procedure. She didn't ask for details. She simply nodded once, as if she'd seen enough families fractured by desperation to know when someone was telling the truth. After she left, I felt a small but meaningful shift inside me, as though a fraction of the overwhelming weight had been lifted off my chest. I still had a long road ahead, but for the first time since waking up, I wasn't completely alone. When Evelyn returned mid-morning with her perfect makeup and her too soft voice, I kept my expression neutral and allowed her to believe I was drifting in and out of consciousness. She fussed over me in a way that would have seemed tender to anyone else, adjusting the blanket, touching my forehead, pretending to wipe non-existent dust from the tray beside the bed. But the moment she thought I wasn't aware, her gaze hardened, calculating and cold. She checked her phone repeatedly, her thumbs trembling slightly as she typed rapid messages. I pretended to be disoriented and asked what time it was, just to see how she reacted. She jolted slightly, as though guilty, then plastered on a smile and told me not to worry about the time, that I needed rest. There was something in her tone, impatience wrapped in sweetness, that made my stomach tighten. She wanted me quiet, compliant, unaware. And for now, I had to give her just enough of that illusion to keep her confident. What unsettled her most, though, was when the nurse, Torres, returned earlier than expected to administer medication. Evelyn's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, and her hand tightened around her phone. She didn't like people interrupting her unsupervised visits. Torres noticed, of course, she noticed everything. She checked the machines, asked me how my pain level was, then glanced briefly at Evelyn with a professional politeness that carried an undercurrent of cool distance. When Torres left the room, it felt like Evelyn's composure slipped for half a heartbeat. She stood quickly, adjusting her dress even though it didn't need adjusting, and said she would return later after handling important errands. The phrasing was off. She normally loved spelling out her day in detail, as though she wanted to prove she carried responsibilities, but today she was vague, rushed, unsettled by a nurse who wasn't in her sphere of influence. When she walked out, she didn't look back. And that small detail told me more than any words could have. She was beginning to panic. Once she was gone, Torres slipped back in almost immediately, closing the door behind her before speaking in a low voice. She told me Evelyn had stood outside the door for nearly 40 seconds after leaving, checking over her shoulder twice, as though she expected someone to follow her. That kind of paranoia didn't belong to a grieving wife, it belonged to someone who feared exposure. Torres also mentioned something odd. Evelyn had requested access to my medical files earlier in the week, claiming she needed clarification for insurance purposes. The request was denied due to privacy restrictions, but the fact she attempted it made my blood run cold. She was looking for something. Maybe signs of when I first began waking up. Maybe notes indicating I was becoming more aware. Maybe simply confirmation that the coma had truly ended. Whatever the reason, it told me she was operating with a timeline that was tightening around her. And tightening timelines make dangerous people even more volatile. As the day stretched into afternoon, I felt a tremor of exhaustion ripple through me, but I resisted the urge to rest. I needed my mind clear when Marcus called again. I didn't know when he would, but I needed to be ready. I practiced moving my fingers more, forcing strength back into my hands, each small motion painful but necessary. I tested my voice in soft murmurs, preparing to sound stable enough when Marcus finally reached me. And all the while, I repeated one truth in my mind like a mantra. I am not powerless. Not anymore. When the faint vibration of my phone buzzed in the bedside drawer, it sent a jolt through my body that was almost painful, not because the sound was loud but because I had been waiting for it with a tension so sharp it felt like wires pulled tight beneath my skin. My fingers trembled as I reached for the drawer, the muscles in my arm protesting the movement, but I forced myself through the discomfort until the phone was finally in my hand. The caller ID wasn't visible because the screen dimmed before I could fully lift it, but I knew, instinctively, that it had to be Marcus. No one else would risk calling a man who had been declared mentally unfit just weeks earlier. No one else would dare break through the isolation Evelyn had wrapped around me. I swiped to answer, bringing the phone close to my ear, and whispered his name with a hoarseness that came from both weakness and a desperate relief I had been holding inside for too long. His voice came through low but urgent, carrying the energy of someone who had been fighting battles on my behalf long before I even regained consciousness. Hearing him speak my name, clearly and without hesitation, felt like a lifeline thrown to me from the world outside this sterile cage. Marcus didn't waste time on pleasantries. He launched directly into what he had uncovered since the last time we spoke, his words moving fast but precise, like an attorney pacing through evidence he had rehearsed 1,000 times. He told me that Evelyn had tried to rush through the final transfer of voting rights for the company, pushing for expedited signatures under the justification that I would have wanted the transition to proceed for the sake of operational continuity. The board had been split, some loyal to me, some manipulated by Evelyn, but none of them knew I was capable of speaking or understanding. She had been selling them a story of long-term cognitive uncertainty, painting herself as the grieving yet responsible spouse who simply wanted to uphold my legacy. Marcus said she presented forged medical notes, heavily altered documents claiming my neurological state was far worse than reported, and the most disturbing part was that she almost succeeded. A meeting had been scheduled for the following morning to finalize everything. If she pulled it off, she would legally own controlling interest in the company I built from scratch. As he explained all of this, I felt an icy stillness settle inside me, not panic this time but something colder, sharper, a resolve that crystallized like frost along the edges of my awareness. This wasn't just betrayal anymore, it was eradication. She wasn't trying to steal from me. She was trying to erase me. I whispered back to Marcus everything I had overheard the night before, forcing the words through the rasp in my throat, describing her pacing, her near-confessional panic, her fixation on final signatures, and the fact that she seemed terrified of him. He went silent for a moment, absorbing what I said, and then his voice dropped even lower, so low I had to strain every fiber of my concentration to hear him. He told me that meant she wasn't confident in her forged documents, that she knew if anyone examined the signatures closely, inconsistencies would surface. It also meant she suspected someone inside the hospital might be reporting unusual behavior. When he said that, my eyes flicked instinctively toward the door, suddenly aware of how vulnerable this room was. Anyone could walk in. Anyone could overhear. Marcus instructed me to keep pretending weakness when Evelyn arrived again, to act unfocused and drowsy so she wouldn't rush her final plans out of fear. He said he was already preparing an injunction and gathering affidavits that would freeze every transfer, but he needed one more thing to make his case airtight: proof I was conscious, coherent, and capable of making decisions. That was the moment I felt the weight of the situation shift onto my shoulders. I wasn't just a victim lying in a bed waiting to be rescued, I had to participate in my own salvation. My voice was thin but steady when I told him I could hold a conversation, that I could testify, even if only through a recorded call or written note. Marcus exhaled so sharply I could almost hear the tension leave his chest. Then he told me to stay ready, because he was coming to the hospital tonight with papers Evelyn could never talk her way around. Just as he was outlining what I needed to prepare for, the door handle clicked, a soft, metallic sound that felt like a gunshot in the stillness of the room. I froze, clutching the phone against my chest, my heart pounding so loudly I feared it would give me away. The door opened slowly, and for one terrifying second I thought it was Evelyn catching me mid-conversation. But it wasn't. It was Torres, her expression calm but her eyes sharp as they landed on the phone in my hand. She closed the door behind her with deliberate quiet and stepped closer, lowering her voice as she asked if everything was okay. I told her I was speaking with my lawyer, and instead of looking alarmed or uncertain, she nodded once, as if confirming a suspicion she had carried silently. She whispered that Evelyn had already been in the building earlier than usual, moving through the hallway like she expected trouble, her steps quick and her face tight. Torres said she overheard Evelyn at the front desk asking if any calls had been made from my room, which meant she was already paranoid enough to imagine I might regain the ability to communicate at any moment. That level of fear meant she was losing control. And people losing control often made dangerous, unpredictable decisions. Before leaving, Torres insisted on doing one more thing. She unplugged the room phone and placed a small rolling tray in front of the door, angled in such a subtle way that it wouldn't block anyone from entering but would make a loud scraping noise if someone tried to open the door quickly. She told me this was not standard procedure, but she didn't trust the situation, and she wanted to make sure no one could walk in without me knowing first. Her voice was steady, but her eyes carried a warning, that Evelyn was becoming desperate. And desperation, Torres reminded me, makes people reckless. After she stepped out, I raised the phone back to my ear, but the call had already disconnected. Marcus would call again soon, he had to. And when he did, I needed to be ready with every detail, every strength I could gather. Because tonight, before the clock ran out, everything was going to move. And I wasn't sure who would walk into my room first. Marcus with salvation, or Evelyn with the final strike. The hours leading up to nightfall felt stretched and distorted, as though time itself was reluctant to carry me toward whatever awaited at the end of this long, suffocating day. The hospital lights dimmed gradually until only the flicker of monitors lit the room, bathing everything in an eerie blue glow that made my skin appear almost translucent. I lay still, listening to every sound, the hum of machines, the shuffle of distant footsteps, the distant echo of an intercom that always crackled before announcing something irrelevant. But underneath those ordinary noises, I sensed something else, a tension in the atmosphere like the air just before a storm hits. I kept replaying Marcus's last words, the urgency in his voice when he told me he was coming tonight with the documents that could stop Evelyn's takeover. I rehearsed what I would say, what I needed to sound like, how strong I needed to appear. Fear and adrenaline twisted inside me, forming a strange mixture that made my hands shake even though I forced them to remain still under the blanket. I wasn't sure whether I feared Evelyn walking in first or feared Marcus wouldn't make it in time. Either way, I knew the next few hours would determine everything: my company, my life, the truth of who Evelyn was behind the flawless mask she wore so effortlessly. The tray Torres had placed near the door remained where she left it, angled just enough to catch on the door if someone tried to enter too quickly. It was my small alarm system, a crude but meaningful protection. When she checked on me earlier, she reminded me to keep my responses short and weak if Evelyn showed up again, but to signal her quietly if anything seemed off. I appreciated her calmness, the way she seemed unshaken in the face of all this tension, but deep down I knew she was just as aware as I was that we were dealing with someone who had already gone too far to turn back. Evelyn wasn't simply greedy or manipulative, she was cornered now, desperate to finish what she had started before her web of lies collapsed. As the evening deepened into night, I found myself drifting through memories, our early years together, the laughter, the warmth, the illusion of partnership. It was strange how betrayal rewrites the past, casting shadows over moments that once felt golden. I wondered how long she had been planning all this. Was it months? Years? Did she ever love me in the way she claimed, or was I merely the vessel that carried her to a life she could never build on her own? The questions gnawed at me, but I forced myself to focus. There would be time for reflection later, if I survived tonight. A sudden clang jolted me upright, the tray skidded an inch, scraping sharply against the floor. My pulse surged. Someone was at the door. But the door didn't fully open. Instead, a pause, a breath, and then a soft, deliberate turn of the handle. Whoever was on the other side realized something had been placed there and was trying to open the door slowly enough not to alert me. That alone told me all I needed to know: it wasn't a nurse. It wasn't security. And it wasn't Marcus. The door creaked open just enough to reveal a familiar silhouette before slipping wider, and Evelyn stepped inside with a careful, measured grace that immediately confirmed she was aware of the tension in the room. She closed the door behind her, her eyes scanning the floor before rising to meet mine. Her expression attempted softness, but there was an edge to it, a flicker of anxiety she failed to hide. She walked toward the bed slowly, clasping her hands together as though preparing an emotional performance, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then she said my name, quietly, almost reverently, and told me she needed to talk to me about some important things before tomorrow. Her voice wavered slightly on the last word, betraying her. I kept my gaze unfocused, my breaths shallow, playing the weakened patient she believed me to be. She moved closer, pulling the visitor's chair near the bed, sitting with her knees together like someone preparing to deliver a confession wrapped in false sincerity. She started by telling me how stressful things had been, how hard she had worked to hold everything together in my absence, how much pressure had been placed on her shoulders. The words flowed easily, practiced, like she'd recited them in the mirror. She told me she made decisions she never wanted to make, decisions that she claimed were meant to protect my legacy. But beneath her words was a tremor, a fear she couldn't quite mask. She leaned forward, studying my eyes closely as if searching for signs of understanding, or danger. When she saw nothing but vague confusion, she continued, this time with a sharper undertone. She said some people were trying to sabotage the company, that not everyone wanted what was best for me, that even Marcus had been acting erratically. Hearing her use his name like that ignited something inside me, a flash of anger so strong I nearly reacted. But I swallowed it down, keeping my expression blank. Evelyn needed to believe she still had control. She needed to believe I was still half lost in fog. Just as she reached for my hand, attempting to lace her fingers through mine with feigned tenderness, a loud, firm knock struck the door. She froze. The knock came again, 3 sharp raps, decisive, commanding. Evelyn pulled her hand back slowly and stood, smoothing the front of her dress as though preparing to face a firing squad. The door opened before she could reach it, and Marcus stepped inside, followed by a hospital administrator and Torres, all wearing expressions that told me this moment had been planned with precision. Marcus's eyes locked onto mine first, silently checking whether I was conscious enough to proceed. I gave the slightest nod. It was all he needed. He turned to Evelyn, who stiffened as he presented a folder thick with filings, affidavits, and the injunction that froze every corporate transfer she had attempted to push through. Her face drained of color as he explained, clearly, succinctly, that she was now under investigation for fraud, medical manipulation, and attempted misappropriation of assets. She tried to object, to twist the narrative, but the administrator cut in, stating that she had already attempted unauthorized access to my records and that her presence here was now restricted pending legal review. Everything unfolded quickly after that. Security wasn't rough with her, but they were firm, guiding her out as she hurled accusations, insisting she was the victim, that I was confused, that Marcus had manipulated me. Her voice echoed down the hallway until the door finally shut, sealing the chaos outside. In the sudden quiet, Marcus approached my bed, placing the folder gently beside me. He told me it was over, that she couldn't touch the company now, and that the board had been notified I was mentally competent and able to resume decision-making pending medical clearance. Relief washed over me so powerfully that I nearly cried, the weight on my chest lifting for the first time since I opened my eyes in this hospital. Torres gave me a small, reassuring smile before slipping out, leaving Marcus and me alone. As I lay there, breathing deeply, the reality of everything hit me, not just the betrayal, not just the narrow escape, but the truth that I had survived a war waged in silence while I was trapped in darkness. And even though the story ended tonight, my life, my real life, was just beginning again.